welcome to this episode of Invest Africa. In today's discussion, we're tackling cross-border trade on the African continent. And to help me dissect this, I'm joined by Benson Mwesigwa. He's a senior manager and Africa executive at KPMG Africa. We also have Dianna Games. She is the chief executive of Africa at Work, and she's also the author of Business in Africa, a Corporate Insights. And from our Cape Town studio, we're joined by Facey is the Vice President for Operations, and this is for DHL Express Sub-Saharan Africa. And we always go continental. Joining us from Lagos is Bisi Sanda, and he is a partner at EY. Everyone, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Dianna, I'm going to give you the floor first, not only because you're the lone woman in the pack, but also as the author who's also trying to capture the ease of doing business on the African continent. Set the landscape for us, paint the picture. What does Africa look like at this point, and what is the state of cross-border trade?
I think there's a commonly quoted figure of 12% of intra-African trade, of Africa's total trade. That figure varies according to regions. I think East Africa, you find the trade is much higher. People just throw out that one figure. I think it doesn't really represent the picture in all parts of the continent, and really brings down by the lowest common denominator. We've got, as you know, they're launching the negotiations for the tripartite free trade area this week.
Yeah.
The East African community is really moving ahead very fast in terms of deeper integration. I think it's one thing to have integration on paper, or possibly even discussions towards it. It doesn't mean goods are flowing freely across borders. It is still expensive to move goods around. We still have a lot of work to do on rail to make it easier and cheaper to move goods. And also there's a lot of other factors, like, for example, a lot of African production is not competitive.
Yeah.
People in Africa spend more time buying imported products than they do African products. And there's a whole range of reasons for that, which we can go into at another point.
So you've given us a couple of points that I think we can latch onto. So Benson, let me start off by getting you to come in and maybe just to give us a sense of the 12% that Dianna is saying. It's not really an accurate reflection of what's happening on the continent, because we have pockets where there's deeper integration than in other parts. How would you describe the context and the state of cross-border trade on the continent?
Yeah, of course, we must realize that in Africa, it's very hard to have realistic data because of the complexities and the investment in that space. So that figure, to really ascertain it, it's very hard. But also, you can't deny the fact that there's growth. There's in intra-trade growth is really high, and it's a signpost, and it's a sign of growth for Africa, and there's a lot of interest. So I think, yes, on one side it's very hard to measure, but in context, we see a lot of interest from investors globally, even within Africa. And this is being fueled by the regional integration, like she mentioned, in East Africa, and then the ECOWAS in West Africa, and then here SADC. Of course, it's a process. These things you don't come here and then have a single region in a day. It takes a process, and there are frameworks that must be ratified. But we see progress, where some have been advanced, like in East Africa, and others, there's still some work to be done, but the whole picture is that we get
so
there.
It's a process, and
Yes.
it's one that you're saying is evolving. Before we get the industry perspective of a player in the field who's experiencing Africa on the ground, let's go to Lagos. We've spoken about East Africa. Benson has now put ECOWAS on the map. BC, give us a sense from a West African perspective. Are there positive movements along this process of progression that Benson speaks about that suggests that that cross-border trade, at least in that region, is improving?
I don't think one can say it's improving per se. Just as Dianna said, enumerating some of the issues militating against cross-border trade in Africa, the consumer is not buying a bundle of sentiments. It's essentially buying a bundle of products and services to meet to get solution to certain needs of his. And as Dianna said, the production in most of African countries aren't competitive at all. Maybe we come around to all the issues around it. So essentially, there isn't any advantage in one country trying to buy goods from across the other country. Even within the country, goods that travel over several kilometers to get to your nation often land in your nation far cheaper than the ones that are produced by the local manufacturers. So the African governments must come to terms with the issue of why is production not competitive in Africa.
Let me jump in because I think you raised a number of really important points and I don't want us to lose them. And one of them, and Dianna, I'm going to throw this to you because I saw you smile as it says this. It says, consumers are not buying a bundle of sentiments. Consumers want real products. I'll get to that, but let's go to Cape Town first. And I want to bring Oliver into this conversation. Oliver, you're a player on the ground. You've got real on the ground experience of cross-border trade or trying to move goods at least across borders on the African continent. Is the picture getting any better?
First of all, I think we should be grateful that trade is indeed growing. I heard 12% intra-Africa trade growing, so that's a positive to start with. What we also should be asking ourselves is what that intra-Africa trade really should look like and how we can get there. On the ground, absolutely. There is many barriers to moving trade around Africa easily. That is everything from infrastructure, road, rail, air. Just on the air, for example, which is where we specialize, a lot of over 12% of cities in Africa are only served by one flight a week, which in itself is a restriction in how we can connect with a large, diverse population. Another area is customs and regulations and other regulatory bodies. We, as a company, DHL, we really want to move trade fast, efficient, and meet the customer demands. However, not all customers understand that to move goods across borders, we have to accommodate the regulations, we have to stick to regulations, we have to be compliant. And with the regulation diversity across Africa, it makes it a very difficult scenario, which is why we really welcome the efforts being put in place at the moment to move ahead the tripartite free trade association, but also beyond that is moving towards the Abuja agreement in '91, where we're trying to get Africa, or Africa is trying to get Africa through the Africa Union to achieve that African economic community, which, seeing models around the world, somewhere like maybe NAFTA or European Union, these are models that work, not without their problems, but they work. And in our world, on the ground, if we can get good, solid agreements put in place through these trade associations and actually then stick to those, then we could really see some massive improvements.
Oliver, I want to pick up on something that you've just touched on. I want to throw it back to you at Dianna, because you raised the issue of the free trade area that's under negotiation. Oliver is putting again some of earlier agreements that need to come into fruition. Is policy keeping pace with the requirements of what's needed on the ground? Are agreements actually progressing to practical application?
My view is that policy is not keeping up with what's on the ground. What you're getting is a real tension between regional interests and national interests. So a lot of governments are looking at their own national interests and not looking at the bigger picture, the greater good of the bigger picture. And I think then you do have agreements that aren't implemented. So that's another layer of problems that in these free trade agreements. For example, the Yamoussoukro agreement for free skies, 50 odd years, I can't remember exactly. And the cost of flying around Africa is still very high as a result.
But why are we stuck, Benson, in this paradigm of, even within regional communities, that there's still national self-interest that comes first? Because clearly we're never going to move forward if we're not going to actually start looking at how do we position the region in the global value chain. What's it going to take for us to move forward?
Nozi, thank you. I think that's a big challenge for most of for trade in Africa. And yes, there's talk, but implementation is what is crucial to move, to have tangible results on the ground. So yes, we must also say that, from my view, if I speak from East Africa perspective, Yes, you can see there are some benefits, for example, around resource mobility. If you are Ugandan and you want to set up a business in Rwanda or Kenya, you don't need a work permit or a visa. And those are serious issues that investors really need if we want to fuel growth on Africa. So I think this will require political commitment, because in Africa, still governments still call the shots. So the moment we have that commitment from the political heads, because they are the key decision makers, so that they can pass these policies and regulations which enhance integration through movement of goods and services, and have a deeper cooperation in infrastructure development. That's when you really see...
So you raise a very important point, because we're about to go to break. Before we do that, let's quickly go to Bisi back in Lagos, and let's talk about the infrastructure question that's being put on the table, where, again, I think everybody agrees that investment into infrastructure needs to be a priority if we are going to see a move from this 12% to a greater double-digit number. From your perspective, are you getting the sense that transport infrastructure is given the policy priority that it requires for us to move in that direction?
I don't think we are talking about infrastructure, we should limit it to just transportation, because studies have confirmed that the lack of power makes African industries, especially sub-Saharan African industries, to be up to about 30% less competitive with other parts of the world. And so the question of infrastructure has got to be taken up holistically. I'm aware that in the West African sub-region, there have been some initiative by some development finance institution to float a West African focused shipping line. Why is that? Because the land transport has become a problem which the government has been unable to solve. Fortunately, the waterways are there, so it's just a matter of getting your acts together to be able to, roll over the water.
We need to broaden this conversation if we're going to be looking at infrastructure investment. It can't just be about transport infrastructure. We need to look at infrastructure investment across the board. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we dig just a little bit deeper into cross-border trade in Africa and how we're going to be shifting from this 12%, which has become a common indicator of just how much trade we have taking place on the continent. We'll see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back to Invest Africa, and thank you so much for staying with us. And still with me are my guests here in Johannesburg. I've got Benson Mwesigwa. He's a senior manager and Africa executive at KPMG Africa. Dianna Games is also here in Johannesburg. She is the chief executive of Africa at Work and the author of Business in Africa, Corporate Insights. Joining us from the tip of the African continent in Cape Town is Oliver Facey. He's the vice president of operations for DHL Express Sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, in Lagos, we are joined by Bisi Sanda. He is a partner at EY. Now, one of the points that Bisi raised before we went to break was whether development finance institutions are coming to the party. So let me throw a question to Cape Town on the basis of that comment and bring Oliver into the conversation. Say, Oliver, let's talk about the funding of initiatives like infrastructure that will enable better and accelerated cross-border trade in Africa. Do you get a sense that from a funding perspective, both governments and institutional investors and the private sector are coming to the party and really putting their dollars behind getting cross-border trade to be more efficient on the continent?
I think if you travel around Africa, you see a huge amount of development going on, whether it be roads, whether it be airports, whether it be ports. Less so on the railway. I understand there are some significant projects underway, but there's a lot of development going on. I guess the question is are they all connected with each other? And what we're doing from, if we represent private sector, is there is a lot of development going on in terms of the capability to handle goods from origin, destination, and getting them to points of key infrastructure like airports. So, as a company, we're investing, millions a year on whether it be vehicles, whether it be buildings, whether it be people, education. There's a lot of investment going on, I think, and that's very evident from a lot of the companies you see around Africa. From the government side, I'm not the expert on government infrastructure spending, but you see a lot of positive sentiment, you see a lot of positive result out in the field. And I think, if I was challenged to ask as to if there was something missing, is how does all that connect together? What's the big plan? And we're great at starting things, but are we great at finishing things? And that's really what we've got to see more of, is faster and finished infrastructure projects.
Dianna, can I get you to take a bite at that big question that he's just put on the table? Are we finishing off the projects that we're starting, and is there a master plan that connects every little initiative that everybody's trying to do in their little corner?
I wouldn't say there's a master plan. I think there are definitely regional plans. I know the African Development Bank is very involved in that, in the soft and hard infrastructure. A lot of, another aspect of this is that some of the hard infrastructure is in place. And if you look at the East African community, what they've done is the heads of state have agreed to remove all the impediments to trade that don't cost any money but are simply an issue of policy. And they did away with way bridges, roadblocks. They changed the way goods was being cleared for the region.